Hello and welcome to Mysteries of the Universe with Dr. John DeSalvo, which is me, and Drs. J.J. Hurtak and Drs. Desiree Hurtak. So welcome you guys, and I'm looking forward to this episode on the Shroud of Turin.
Thank you very much. We want to talk about the scientific and spiritual significance of the Shroud, particularly during the holiday season. We all think of the nativity of Christ, but we want to see the concept of the full cycle of birth and death. Who was Christ as a way shower? And is the Shroud some clue to our own evolutionary perspective?
Right. John, I know you actually have a lot of experience in this as well. So we're going to put our point to you. Tell us a little bit of what's your background on the Shroud?
Sure. Well, to give the bottom line first and then I'll go backwards, I've been researching the Shroud for probably over 35 years. And I was the research consultant to the original team that studied the Shroud. And I also wrote a book on the Shroud. But I thought it would be interesting to briefly say how I got interested in the Shroud, and maybe you guys could do the same. So back in 1978, that's when the Shroud of Turin research project got access to the Shroud in Turin, Italy, to do all those, intensive studies, which we'll be talking about. And at that time, I never heard of the Shroud. About a year or two later, I think it's about a year later, I was visiting my mother-in-law, and her cousin was there who had a book on the Shroud. And I looked at the picture and I said, oh my God, this is like worthy of some kind of study. And I didn't know at that time there was a scientific study that was done on it. So my mother-in-law says, oh, this is in New York. The person who coordinated that and got permission from the Vatican was Father Peter Rinaldi, who is a personal friend of mine, and I used to go to his church. And I said, you're kidding. I'd love to meet him. I mean, he's the most famous, personality on the Shroud. So she said, yeah, he goes back and forth from Turin to Portchester, New York. So, me, I'll take a chance. I picked up the phone and called the church rectory and said, is Peter Rinaldi at the church at this time? And they said, yeah, would you like to talk to him? I said, sure. So he gets on the phone and I mentioned, I'm John DeSalvo. I'm a professor of biology and physiology, and I'm interested in talking to you about the Shroud. He goes, all right, good. Can you come over at 2:00 today? I said, yeah, and he hangs up. So I went over and visited him. Talk about a man of royal stature and personality. He welcomed me like a long-lost brother, and we sat down. He wanted to know about my background, and he basically said, you have the perfect background to study the Shroud. You're a biophysicist. You studied physiology. You taught anatomy. You're interested in all this stuff. So he told me to contact the director of the research team, John Jackson, which I did. John later invited me down to Colorado Springs where he was living and brought me into the team as a research consultant and asked me to study the image formation process. And I used the VP8 image analyzer, which we'll talk about, that's used at NASA to study the image. But to back up a little, so I was working with Dr. Jackson and some of the members of the Shroud of Turin research project. And a few years later, one of the problems at that time, and I guess I could say this now, the people didn't have access to all the data and the research. The team kind of kept it within themselves. They were very closed about it. And maybe they should, because there was a lot of, misinformation. So Father Rinaldi asked me to start a new international research team to incorporate all disciplines and allow multidisciplinary study and bring people in who really wanted to study, who were really kept out of it. And so we talked about it, and we figured we'll bring in Dr. Frederick Zuggaby, who was the chief medical examiner in Rockland County. He was known as the Quincy of the East Coast and one of the most famous forensic pathologists. And so we thought he should be president. And I just wanted to be like a director, but they wanted me to be executive vice president. And then Paul Maloney, who you guys know, a good friend of mine who recently passed away, was the general projects director. And we were called Association of scientists and scholars on the Shroud of Turin. Assist. My late wife came up with that because Valerie, we wanted to, and I know you guys loved her, we're really good friends. We wanted a name that implied we're there to help people, to bring people together. So I like the acronym ASSIST. And that's basically a scientists and scholars. It wasn't limited just to physicists and engineers. So it did turn out to be the largest and oldest, because the Stirrup team did phase out. And I guess we're still, I don't even know if we're still active, because after Fred passed away, Paul passed away, and the team is still in existence, but I don't know if anything's being done. Anyway, that's how I kind of got involved. And then I even got to the point where Ray Rogers, who obtained sticky tape samples from the Shroud, you put up a 3M company developed a tape where you can put it up and then take it away and the fibers come off a piece of tape. Like putting a piece of tape up and then you remove it. So, and it was a hydrocarbon base, so it wouldn't contaminate the Shroud. I was sent those samples, even blood samples. I had those in my possession about a month to do studies with some research people and companies. And so I could say, if the Shroud is really the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, I held in my hands the actual blood of Jesus. And I did some microscopy work, and then I brought them actually to Fred in New York, and then we sent them back to where we borrowed them. And you heard of Max Fry, right?
Yeah, so let's talk.
Let's put this in historic perspective, because a lot of people who are watching this do not know much about the Shroud. It's mentioned, of course, in the Gospels, where Peter runs into the tomb. I'm talking about the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 12.
Right, so I just want to say a few things about it for our listeners who aren't really familiar. First of all, you mentioned STIRP, that stands for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. And the Shroud itself, and we've seen it twice, and they only open it on occasion, either some sort of holiday or sometime when the Pope wants to see it. It's actually about 14.5 feet long, or 4.4 meters, something like that. And then the width is about 3.5 feet, a little bit more than 1 meter. And the idea is it actually was an entire cloth. So it draped over the back of it like you're laying on something, but then it came over the front. So you have both the back and the front in it. And Dr. Hurtak was doing research connected with Jet Propulsion Lab, and some of the people from the STIRP were connected with that.
That's right. Yeah. I was a private consultant with colleagues at Jet Propulsion Lab in image enhancement analysis, which is looking at the photos from the space programs and missions, but more specifically, several colleagues, particularly Dr. Don Lin in Los Angeles, working with Dr. Jackson and Dr. Jumper, looking at the details. And we saw the three-dimensional development. It was quite shocking to the NASA scientists, most of whom were agnostic or did not believe that there was a higher science behind the mysterious Shroud. But let me go back to my own experience.
Oh, wait, JJ, before you move on, you mentioned the 3D, because that was my research. And I want to add something that the history of the Shroud, we can document it precisely from 1357 to the present, because that one was when the first exposition was held in Lille, France. So if it, if it is a forgery, it would have to have been made prior to that. But we actually have found even earlier manuscripts, like the Hungarian Prey manuscript, that dates back to the 6th, 7th, 8th century, where there's drawings of the Shroud with markings that clearly identify it. So we can bring it back pretty far. Now, in 1898, this is what you were referring to, the first photographs were taken by a lawyer, Secondo Pia. He was actually the second one. One of the Paris priests took a snapshot, but he didn't get in the press. And it turned out the Shroud itself, the image, is a photographic negative. Okay, you got it. That's how the Shroud would look to the naked eye. And then when you develop the negative plate, Secondo Pia saw a positive, meaning a real-alike image. So how could the Shroud have existed hundreds of years before the invention of photography and be a negative? And then Dr. Jackson, who I worked with, put the image of the Shroud, a photograph, under an image, a device known as the VP8 image analyzer, which NASA uses, and it reconstructs three-dimensional, three-dimensional photographs. And that was my research. We'll talk about that later, but my research was based on reconstructing three-dimensional images of the shroud and objects that may give us an idea of how the shroud was produced. So now we've got a cloth at least going back to 1357. It's a photographic negative hundreds of years before the invention of photography, and the VP8 analyzer is just a modern object. So we have three-dimensional information encoded in this ancient object. So I wanted to throw that in to show you how phenomenal it is.
Well, I just want to say it's very important to realize that there is no paint on the cloth. I think that's very important for people to know. There is blood, which is interesting. As you said, you touched it. And from what they feel, and they've actually tested, it's definitely kind of human or animal type. And they think it's AB. And it may
let me stop you there.
Okay.
They did the fluorescent antibiotic test on it, and I have a problem with that. The amount of sample they used to me wasn't sufficient enough to come to that conclusion. But I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but that could be a problem, to claim that yet.
Well, but that's what they think is there. That's the only thing. And of course, if it is 2,000 years old, it's very hard to even get that exactly. Thing. So you have a lot of issues with that. Also, I think the important thing for most people who have followed it is that not so many years ago, they had taken a sample of the cloth, but the cloth itself is linen, which is flaxseed. And what they took, unfortunately, was on the periphery of the cloth, because they didn't want to take the middle. And it turned out the part that they took was cotton. Now they know that there was a fire and there needed to be some repair done by French nuns. And they had repaired it in that time with cotton. So when you go, and they actually sent it to a lot of places like Oxford and other places to get the dating all came back about the time of
right. I went down to actually Arizona's lab to talk to the director before they did the carbon 14 dating, which came out around 1260 to 1390. And yeah, that is there's other problems, but it appears the piece exactly as what you said was from a side strip. Now, why would there be a side strip? Well, the image wasn't maybe balanced in the center. So part of it, they had to add a side strip in the medieval times to balance the image. So it's not unusual that it would turn out to be middle-aged. Here's a piece of the shroud that I have. Can I get this here? Where's the
all right.
Here's the reliquary, a little piece of it. And actually, I'm not sure this is the shroud or the backing cloth. It could be the backing cloth. The shroud is a specific weave, 3-to-1 herringbone. But the point I'm trying to make about the shroud is that and you said you're right, there's no paintings that have been found on it. And the testing, it is blood. We're pretty sure it's human blood. Dr. John Heller, who's a biophysicist who passed away, did a lot of great tests on it.
Exactly that the testing that many people had seen coming out that said it was medieval was from not the real shroud piece. The real shroud is linen, flaxseed fiber, and they had a sample of cotton, which means it had to be added. So they have actually never officially carbon tested. Now, some of the Italian research, which I find really fascinating, that's going on is by two main people. One is Fanti and another person named Giuseppe Baldacchini. And they have actually looked at how could you possibly get this image on the shroud where you don't have paint, and how could that be done? And they've used excimer lasers, in particular argon fluoride and xenon chloride, and they've seen how one thing we always say, there's also like a little bit of a film on top of flaxseed or linen. And a lot of it is on that, and a very little bit is also, they've been able to now determine, is in these fibers, but it's not even going through practically the entire thing. It's so minute. And they're saying the only way to have done that is by UV or some sort of like light burst.
Yeah, I heard that. I'm very skeptical of that research, but one thing I wanted to mention about that, think about this. There's no image under the blood-stained areas.
Yeah.
So the blood had to go on first, and then somebody would paint an image around that. It's not comprehensible. So, but there's like, to be honest with you, there's 100, or actually probably 500 theories, from gamma rays to what you mentioned. And the problem is, when you really look at those in detail, none of them completely match the image on the shroud. They come close, you know, even my theory, but it's still, it's just speculation. And it does, I think their image that they produce doesn't give off the spectrographic exact characteristics that the color of the shroud does. But
well, no,
you know.
I think they started doing this around 2008, actually, and then 2011, and then by 2012 and 13, they feel they can get the exact coloration. So, but let's hear your theory, then we'll talk more about this one. What do you think,
wait,
John?
I do want to, again, for those who are not familiar with this, we all call, in quotation marks, relic of Christian civilization, why we'd be interested in talking about this at this time. And of course, you know that our work is working with not only the themes of ultra-terrestrial intelligence that would exist in superluminal energy forms, and reports that we have shared both from the Taoistic traditions, the Buddhistic traditions, as well as the Judeo-Christian, suggest that there's holy flesh, or flesh that glows. There's a whole aspect that drew me into this study years ago as a young scholar studying the Coptic manuscripts in Egypt that speak of Jesus being able to transcend in a light body. And Dr. Jumper was interested in this, in the process of his death on the cross, that Jesus go into a highly sublimated state where he left his body, was his body discorporated. Jesus appears now, according to the lost text, in the Coptic in a body of light back with his disciples. And so there's always these mysteries, and we as scientists want to look behind the mythology to the real science.
But I think what they're showing with this excimer laser is the fact that this light burst, which would be ultraviolet in nature or in that direction, is exactly what also Dr. Hurtak's book, The Keys of Enoch, is showing. If we go from matter into a higher frequency of light energy, where every cell of our body is transformed, we would probably go through the ultraviolet portion of the spectrum first, and that would have enough to imprint onto the shroud. And this is exactly what these two scientists are talking about.
Yeah, I again, I'll have to relook at their work, but I had a problem with some of their data. To make a long story short, we can rule out the painting hypothesis because there's no paints or pigments on the shroud, right? We can also rule out like a burst of a scorch, because a scorch fluoresces under UV light, the shroud image doesn't. And, you know, we can go on, even like radiography, a burst of X-rays, gamma rays. A lot of people have proposed some of the real esoteric theories. But again, that's the bottom line, is the shroud image is only like the first couple thousandths of an inch of the shroud. So it's a surface phenomena. It doesn't like sink into the cloth. So that's important. So what you're talking about, that kind of idea would make more sense, because it theoretically would produce a surface phenomena. Me being I'll just tell you my theory real quick. My being a biophysicist, I taught biochemistry, anatomist. I tried to look for a scientific explanation, and I kind of took a little bit from a lot of different other people's work. But what I found out was, and this is strange, being a rare book collector, I noticed in books where plants have been left for like hundreds of years. Many of you have seen this, right? Like an imprint of the plant. The imprint, that's known as a Voltwinger pattern, because Gene Voltwinger discovered that many, many years ago. And he contacted me and congratulated me on my work. I thought that was the closest to the shroud image of anything I've seen. So I first did spectroscopic studies, ultraviolet studies. I mapped out a spectrum, matched the shroud exactly. It looks like a negative, exactly. Then the acid test to me was using a VP8 image analyzer. So I contacted a company that had a VP8 image analyzer and looked at the plant images, and guess what? They were produced in three-dimensional projection, just like the shroud. The only, I think, two places in nature that we get this. So doing more studies on the composition of the shroud and knowing what the chemicals were, I believe and this is from other people's work. Some people think it was a direct contact where the cloth came and impregnated the cloth with like the sweat, which has lactic acid, and lactic acid could oxidize the linen. In fact, that's what the linen is. The image on the shroud is just oxidized cellulose, but on the surface. The problem is if you put like paint on your face and put a handkerchief of it and opened it, it'd be distorted, and the shroud is not distorted. It could be vapographic, where the vapors went directly straight out. The problem is if you calculate the distances, you would not get the resolution you see. So I propose a direct contact vapographic theory. I stole a little bit from everybody, you know, and a combination of that biochemical process could explain the color, the negativity, the 3D. But I always say my theory only probably explained about 60% of the data. It does not produce a surface phenomena. It does penetrate into the fiber. But I think it's a combination of a natural process and maybe a supernatural process, which AJ and you were talking about.
Yes, Dr. Jumper looked at the backside of the cloth, which never was fully examined until the strip group got together in '78. And then some of our colleagues at Jet Propulsion Lab in Los Angeles also looked and studied the images that were taken and were amazed that the light on the front side and the back side of the cloth was evenly distributed, which would mean that the body had to be in a weightless state with energies that would be like a small biophotonic explosion that took place for this even distribution on all sides of the cloth. So obviously it wasn't painted on, it was in a higher state of energy transfer.
So the real question is, how long did it take to put the image on the cloth? Was it very, very quickly, or was it over a period of time? Because describing it would take a little bit of time, at least the chemical, degeneration or regeneration of the cloth.
That's a great question, because like the Voltwinger patterns take hundreds of years, and the first reference to the shroud was really around the 800s with the image of Odessa, which we think that was the shroud. The image was the king of Odessa was dying and wanted to see Jesus, but Jesus couldn't come to him. But supposedly Jesus put a cloth up to his face and gave it to, I think it was Thaddeus, who then brought it to the king and it was just a face, and that supposedly cured the king. But what's really interesting, if you take the shroud and fold it 4 ways, you have the face directly in the center. And I don't know if you realize this, but when I was visiting Dr. Jackson, he was showing me some x-rays of the cloth, and we actually could see the fold lines in the x-ray, how it was folded, and that would have produced that image. But you're right. I'm guessing we're talking about maybe hundreds of years before it developed.
But let me put this into a greater perspective of why Desiree and I are personally involved in this. As many of our listeners know, in 1973, I had a remarkable experience where I was meditating on the ancient text, and my mind was shifted into a higher state. And I saw in this higher state the risen Christ in an energy form. And I saw the face connected with light that was coming down through the body, as would be depicted in the Chinese acupuncture charts of the 12 meridians.
Really?
It was very clear to me at that time that the whole mystery of why the crucifixion was to take place was to show that we had this ability to shift from a 3rd dimensional reality to a 5th dimensional reality by attunement of these energy meridians. And if you look very carefully at the crown of thorns that was placed upon the head, we have the realization of the acupuncture points. This is from some of the work that biofeedback experts have done that I've worked with at the University of California many years ago, showing the letterization or the points where the electrodes were placed over the head so the mind could have a higher perceptual field. Essentially, the acupuncture traditions would suggest that the body could be activated in a very, very special way. And this is what I saw, Christ in a energized body. We would call it a superluminal body of light. And this is consistent with the traditions of the great masters of the Far East and the ancient Near East. The exception being, of course, Christianity is based upon the exclusivity of the Christ figure ascending and then coming back in an energy body to teach disciples that was there in the ancient Near East.
I think you're on the right track. The idea of the light, look, I think it's like a quantum light phenomena.
Right,
and
because
a
if you
day-to-day
say,
experience, you
I
know?
want to bring all the different perspectives into our audience of sharing all of the more recent work going on, because as investigators, as researchers, and more specifically my background, like yours, John, was to look at the image enhancement analysis, is to look at the overall scientific reality behind the mythology, the language.
Exactly.
Myth suggests life after life, but we're looking at the whole process through which this was achieved.
right, so we're saying, and we've been to see the cloth twice, which is fantastic, amazing energy that's there. But we want to say that really, we would feel that the chemistry was first there in the matter energy body, which is what you're talking about.
Right,
And then
right.
in this transformation, we don't believe it took hundreds of years, because we feel that that cloth was then taken by the disciples and kept in private places. Then it really took place, then the radiation burst, we'll call it radiation burst, but ultraviolet transformation that these Italian scientists are looking at, that took place very, very quickly. And that's why you have the perfect positioning of the same light radiation burst on the backside and the front. But what does this really mean if you are Christian? It means that really what was being told us by the disciples afterwards, that he became a light body. He could go back and appear in the flesh temporarily, but then return to that light body, is a reality. And we don't feel that, in fact, many people want to analyze it and say, oh, that's just, hypotheses and it really didn't happen. But we actually feel there's that possibility, because we do feel that there's angels in heaven, and we feel there's ongoing life, and it doesn't certainly exist in the physical form. So what kind of form are these beings in?
I think we're at the chapter of realizing not only are we not alone in the universe is teeming with intelligence, but that intelligence would be in a different state, the fifth dimensional state.
Or more.
Yeah. In my experience, which changed my life, was to show that we could converse and communicate with beings who were in a type of light design. We call this a corpus luminosity.
And of course, in this case of Jesus, that every matter cell in his body was transformed into light energy. Now, we're not saying that with every person. We're saying that the soul then goes on into energy forms in a little bit slightly different way, but it's still into the same place, perhaps, that Jesus himself is existing.
I look at, being a physicist, I look at more as probably a quantum effect. And I think the way you explained it, which actually I've never heard before, is the closest that I would agree with the best possibility of the image being produced. Because your idea of the light energy, I love the acupuncture points, the energy, the reason Christ was crucified, could produce a surface phenomena. And explain some of the anomalies which we can't explain. The thing is, with all my 30 years work on the Shroud, I always say we still don't know how the image was produced, because all these, biochemical, physiological, anatomical explanations don't really explain it, including my theory. So we really, I think, like what you two are doing, you have to look at something higher, a higher consciousness, a higher process.
Also, Ray Rogers changed his position at Los Alamos. He was skeptic. He changed in terms of the new information that is coming in with better analysis that is being made, not along the edges of the cloth, but in the actual center of the cloth and also the underside of the cloth. Let me put it to the audience in a different way. When we are born, our consciousness is crucified to our body, which is the cross. So if you were coming from a higher dimensional world and you wanted to show that there was life after life, what better way than to take a great teacher, in the Eastern tradition, an avatar, in the Western tradition, the Son of God, and to show this transformative process connects with the energy meridians in the body and the acupuncture points on the head, to show the crown of light is lifting us into a higher mind of direct experience, where light can pour in, where there's a fusion between the human self and the overself. And there is an understanding that is provided for the eventual acceptance of fifth and sixth dimensional intelligent life.
So I just want to show this paper that we talked about, and I'll put it on the main screen, but it says its deep ultraviolet radiation stimulates the Turin shroud image. So I encourage people to take a look at that. We'll
And the
screen
details of this is
for the
written in the
scientists.
Keys of Enoch in 1973.
And don't forget, the fact is, if we are going into a faster than matter process, it would go through the ultraviolet portion of the spectrum. It doesn't mean he's stuck in the ultraviolet portion. It just means you go through that ultraviolet portion.
So what am I saying? The bottom line is we are being prepared as a humanity to recognize that we're going to be contacted not only by physical extraterrestrials, but also by transphysical ultra-terrestrials. In the cosmology of the Keys of Enoch, our central text, there is a cosmic hierarchy, and Christ represents a higher office of those who have achieved the superluminal aspect of life, who can transit between the dimensions through time translation, and are not limited to the body physical form or the three-dimensional physics that keep us locked into space and time. Rather, we merge now with the paraphysics and a higher cosmology of consciousness that lifts us off our crucified body. We're no longer walking in enslavement to what we call matter, which is gravitationally trapped light.
And it is quantum physics. It's just that they don't require a teleportation back into matter. You can just go from here back into light. And that's where we feel there are angels, there are messengers of light, there are many other realms of intelligence that are not always in the third/fourth dimensional reality.
Did you guys make up the term extra celestial? Because I like that. You used it in one of our shows.
It. I don't want to lay claim to the only one.
I love that. I love that term.
But extra celestials would be in, of course, something much higher than the extraterrestrials that be in a non-physical sense. The corpus design would be of energy rather than flesh.
You know, you see, I wanted just to add that I like this because we both are coming from a different point of view, but I'm coming from, the scientific, what we know, and really we've hit a dead end. You're coming from a higher standpoint and actually can see more of the picture. And that's where I think the answers are going to come from. One of the questions, I have a good question for you guys too, but one of the questions that people always ask me, do you think the shroud is really the burial cloth of Jesus Christ? And I'd say, I don't know. I mean, science hasn't proved it unless you have a time machine. I mean, you have no idea. But maybe in a metaphysical sense, we can have proof. And here's a kind of a crazy question, and you've seen the shroud. Do you think the shroud is alive, like there's psychic alive energy in it?
And one of my friends,
he thinks it's full of energy.
Full of energy.
Okay.
Max Fry, said there was 58 different forms of pollen that they found in the shroud as it made its transit from the Middle East to the Holy Land areas, and then to Europe, and then back to Italy, specifically where it's being housed presently. But to answer your question, one of my friends drew this picture of a person going into a higher state, transfer of energy, and then you have the concept of what that really means and why that's in the Bible. It's to, shall we say, open our mind to the realization that we do go on into a higher body of glory. We're not limited to this short life of earthbound physical matter that we think is the only definition of evolution. Evolution goes on into a much higher perspective.
I want to tell you what I think your greatest contribution to humanity is. You probably know this. For some reason, there's a lot of people out there, especially in the New Age, that hate Christianity or have a bias towards it because of their background or growing up. The church and religion has become their own agenda, throughout the years of control, power. We don't know about the Gospels, how much is true and distorted. And but deep down, I've always felt Christ was special. And your way of looking at the cosmic Christ, that's how you call him, right? The cosmic Christ. And your book, The Keys of Enoch, to me, is the biggest contribution to humanity, because you brought Christ into a setting that makes sense. That's actually a higher level than the religions take it. And it will supersede people's prejudice or bias, and even religion. I mean, there's no reason why somebody who's a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu couldn't accept your cosmic Christ, because it's not locked into a religion. I think that's your biggest contribution when people look back at what you've done, really. I mean, you brought You opened up Christ to the whole world and to all denominations. My greatest contribution was the spaghetti sauce recipe, my uncle.
Thank you, John, for
The
saying that. But
Italian.
let me put this in another perspective.
Well,
If
let's
you look
wrap it
at
up.
if you look at the whole symbolism of Jesus on the cross, you have the blood on the right hand, the left hand, and also the feet. If you look at the Old Testament story of the Passover, the Pesach, which is the area of deliverance out of Egypt, you have the coming of the angel of deliverance, Metatron, or Shaddai as he was also known.
Oh,
You
yeah.
have the Jewish people put blood in 3 places, on the right beam, and then the left beam, and then the bottom beam, which also forms a triangle. So there's a higher correlation in the mystical interpretation of ancient scriptures that speak of the body of the divine passing into the world of the material, the mundane, and then going back into the divine. And that is to guide us. The experience that I had of seeing the cosmic Christ, of seeing the cosmic body of Metatron, of seeing the cosmic body of Melchizedek, or Melchizedek as we say in Hebrew, is to provide a unity between the Judaic, the Christian, even the Sufi traditions that accept that Christ did rise, to show as it were that death is the last enemy would be conquered. So we are at an amazing time to change, as it were, our 3-dimensional perspective into a 5th, as well as a higher dimensional perspective, that we are cosmic citizens enjoying the physical life, but also having the birthright of the eternal life.
And we're really just temporarily here. I think that's important.
Well, you know, I want to just tell people that they really should read your book, The Keys of Enoch, because when I first heard you guys, and I actually had a mystical experience, and you know, we felt we were brought together for a reason. And that book has done the most to alter my consciousness than any other book. So it's not just, but I guess what I'm trying to say, it's not just a textbook or just a book of information. It's a book of transformation. I should have written a blurb for your book. You didn't know me then.
Well,
Maybe the next edition.
This picture from the ancient Near East, which shows the risen Christ, but also shows the hierarchy of beings of light, also with light around their heads, also in glorified areas of experience. And I just wanted to leave our listeners and friends throughout the world with this idea that if cosmic intelligence does return, it means that we shall be elevated as cosmic partners, cosmic citizens. And the mystery of the Christ, showing the man-God partnership, the human evolution, higher evolution partnership that he speaks of, becomes a reality, not just for the few scientists, but for humanity, recognizing that we are being prepared for the most important quantum change in history, recognizing that we are citizens of an ongoing process of evolution that doesn't stop with Mother Earth. And so the way of the cross is for all of us to come off the historic cross. The historic space and time is no more. We are part of the continuum of creation.
So, by the way, after you read the book, Keys of Enoch, Desiree, I'm on my second reading again, your book on the Sophia, which is the best out there.
Sophia, yeah.
Amazing. So maybe we should give out our website information. I know you have it at the end of the credits, but for me, it's GizaPyramid.com. Yeah.
Ours is keysofenoch.org. So it's the Keys of Enoch. There's the ancient book of Enoch, actually, but Dr. Hurtak's book is Keys of Enoch.
Yeah, I keep flipping when I say that. Sorry.
And some of it is also at futurescience.org, because we want to actually show some of the science behind all of the work that we've been doing.
Yeah, you guys got incredible stuff. Also, all of our videos in our series is on YouTube, and it's in Future Science TV, no space, Future Science TV. And if you go to YouTube and just put that in, you can get all our YouTube videos. And there's a lot of them, thousands of listeners. People really like it. And every time I say we're going to be coming out with a new one on Facebook, I just get an overwhelming response. We can't wait. We can't wait. But yeah, you guys have really, I think, transformed this whole area of the cosmic Christ, dimensions, celestial beings. But I really want to do a show with JJ talking about his metaphysical experiences and interaction with Metatron. And like I said, you know, these aren't just, it's not just knowledge. You guys transform the soul in the work you do.
Well, hopefully we have many more shows together.
And we want to wish all of our friends and partners throughout the world the best for the holidays. and understand that God loves you, and so do we. And consider this to be a bridge between the event we call the Nativity of the cosmic Christ, as well as the Easter celebration of going beyond the old hierarchy of Ishtar, which was the etymology of the word Easter. The fact that the old cosmic hierarchy was, shall we say, put to the side when one person recognized that he or she was at spiritual liberty to make their own ascension to the divine grace, the divine love of the Eternal One.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, whatever holiday you celebrate. And wait a minute, the only thing here I noticed, JJ and I have hats. Now, Desiree, she has beautiful blonde hair, so she doesn't need a hat. But maybe we need to get a hat for Desiree for the next show. What do you think? Nah, I like her blonde hair. Let's leave it the way it is. So, yeah, listen, you guys have been great. I tell you, we've known each other, I don't know, 20, 30 years. You've been a great support to me. I love our research, and I think you guys are the best. And I thank you for your contribution to the world. This is kind of a fun show. I know we could go 5 hours on this, so I'll let you guys say the last words.
May we all understand that there is a higher science behind mythology, a myth behind the myth, and there's a spiritual reality and psychology that is in our hearts, that when we find it brings us into the joy and purpose of serving humanity as we cross the thresholds of space and time. Let us stay in harmony, let us stay in love, and let the higher spirit of the cosmic Christ reign in our hearts.
I'll leave it at that. Thank you, John.
Thank you all. God bless.